Hi, everyone. Welcome. We are going to give our attendees about 1 or 2 minutes to jump into the Zoom room, and then we have a very full presentation today. So feel free to take the next minute or two to grab a cup of coffee, water, anything you need, and we'll get started about 2:02. Thanks so much. Hi again, everyone. We're so excited that you have joined us for this afternoon's webinar, Preventing Re-Victimization, the Innovative Approach of Community Courts, presented by Lindsay Price Jackson. We're thrilled to have Lindsay with us today presenting. So we're going to go over a couple of housekeeping things, and then I'm going to turn it over to her. Next slide, please. So some items to keep in mind, this webinar is being recorded. All attendees and folks that registered will get a recording after the session. If you're having any technical issues, you'll see a couple folks on your screen as presenters. One is Dashiell Coleman and the other is Krista Anderson. They both have NCVC after their names. If you're having technical issues, please send a private chat to one of them. They can help you troubleshoot. We are not doing CE credits or attendance certificates for this webinar. We do have live captioning available if you need that. If you go all the way to the bottom of your screen, a couple over from the chat function, you'll see a box with CC and show captions. You can click on that and that will enable the live captioning. And then please make sure that you're putting any questions that you have for Lindsay in the Q&A box. Feel free to chat in the chat box, but any specific questions that you have for her will be taken out of the Q&A box at the end of the session. Next slide, please. So this is the fourth webinar in our Road to NTI series. I know many of you have probably already registered. We would love to have you join us if you have not already. We're having over 60 workshops available over 3 days. We're in Boston this year from September 6th through 8th. And we're happy to answer any questions that you have about the conference. I will warn you, the conference hotel is sold out. So if you are interested in coming, please make your arrangements soon. We have a whole host of hotels listed on our website that are within walking distance. So there's plenty of space available in the area, and we have plenty of registration space. If you have specific questions about the National Training Institute, you can contact us at nationaltraininginstitute@victimsofcrime.org. Next slide, please. And wanted to let everyone know about another webinar that NCVC is going to be assisting with tomorrow. So if you don't have anything planned for tomorrow, now you do. It is going to be a talking circle on standards of care for survivors of human trafficking. And Dash is going to put a link in the chat box to register for that webinar if you're interested. Next slide. And I'm going to turn it over to our presenter from the Center for Justice Innovation, Lindsay Price Jackson. We're thrilled to have you and take it away.
Thank you, Katie. Thanks so much. I'm really honored to be here. I honestly could keep reading the chat and seeing where everyone's coming from and what they're up to for a really long time, but I will forbear. I'll briefly introduce myself. So Lindsay Price Jackson, as was stated, from the Center for Justice Innovation, where I work now on primarily issues of community justice, including things like helping jurisdictions build up community courts or community justice centers. By background, I was a public defender in Philadelphia, working in several problem-solving courts, including in domestic violence court, mental health court, in drug court, and in a human trafficking drug kind of combined rehabilitative type court. I was also a guardian ad litem in child welfare court, so saw all the fun stuff all the time, and did some criminal justice and prosecutor research for Vera Institute and also for Arnold Ventures. And now I'm here at the center doing technical assistance. So really excited about that. I will, at the end of the presentation, make sure that everyone is sent both a handout that's going to have an outline of this presentation, as well as all the citations to any research I may reference today. So don't worry too much about scribbling it all down really fast. You'll get it, you'll have it. I'll make sure that happens. So without further ado, I'll give us a little outline of where we'll go today. Katie said we're going to go fast, and we are. And I want to do that to make sure we have plenty of time at the end if there are any questions. So this is where we will begin. Okay, community justice. This is a growing field and I think really exciting. So the main idea, I would say, is to kind of think grassroots, right? Solving local issues with local solutions. Okay, so I'll introduce a little bit the Center for Justice Innovation and kind of our genesis story. So the center, which formerly was the Center for Court Innovation, if you're feeling like this sounds a little eerily familiar, we recently had a name change. So it really began as a partnership between New York City court system and what was then a scrappy upstart nonprofit, CCI. And that was about 30 years ago at this point. So that would have, if you do the math backwards, would have been around the height of New York City's crack epidemic. And so really the idea was practitioners trying to do something a little bit different that could help break the cycle of recidivism, specifically among low-level offenders in the Times Square neighborhood. We don't think maybe of Times Square as a community, but hear me out, right? The courts were seeing the same people, residents, people who were either unhoused and were residing in Times Square, or who lived in Times Square, people who operated businesses in Times Square, and law enforcement and service providers and people working in the area who were there all the time to create what you would not think of as a very community place, Times Square, but really the same people. We're seeing the different kind of same people over and over, and we were trying to solve some problems here. So they opined really that maybe we can do something different. Maybe we can treat people a little differently. And frankly, at this point, anything's worth a shot. So in lieu of the inevitable slap on the wrist that would come from a court to a low-level offense or crime, they thought maybe we can be more effective and just help restore law and order to our neighborhood, right? Our area in Times Square of Manhattan. So I will give a little spoiler alert. It worked. Okay, so recidivism was going down. Local crime going down. Tourists felt safer, and in fact, they were safer. So what was the secret sauce? What was the magic happening? I will tell you, hold your breath, right? At this point now, fast forward 30 years, the center has replicated what they did in Midtown Community Court. That's what they named that community court project in Times Square 30 years ago. And see up there on the screen. Forgive me, a meeting just let out. So if it's loud to you, let me know and I'll speak louder. that there's both the Midtown Community Court, the Red Hook Community Justice Center, several other what we call operating projects, where we really put these principles of community justice into practice. Aside from that, the center has also created a big internal group of researchers who look at these operating projects to see what's working, and equally or more important, what's not working. And then folks like me on the TA side to be able to share the good news with all the people, right? And we operate in, you can see kind of the bulleted point list there, in several specific subject matter areas. That's me on the community justice bullet. Okay, so decades of this work, all in partnership with the Bureau of Justice Assistance. They were an early partner from the beginning with the Midtown Community Court. That's BJA through the U.S. Department of Justice. Culminated in this joint publication by the center and BJA that came out at the end of last year. And in this document, which I will also share with your outline with the research citations, really lays out what we're calling guiding principles of community justice. And they're really very specifically defined and enumerated. Can't wait to hear your thoughts after you get to read it, which I hope will be soon. And these were what those guiding principles ended up being. I will walk through each of them briefly. So just to kind of give you an idea of what I mean by these principles. So here's the framework of community justice: putting people first, right? The person at the center, not the system at the center, the person at the center. So that means tailoring treatment options to individuals, not having one size fit all outcomes for all types of offenses. Co-creating justice, think that grassroots idea, right? Looking to both the victim and to the larger community for solutions. And one way that community justice projects do this is by having advisory boards of people with lived experience or people who have been survivors of crime, or just other people who are residents in the community who have something to say, about how safe they feel or don't feel in their neighborhood. It also could look like hosting town hall meetings for your local community members to see what issues are going on and where a court might be able to intervene. I'll be honest, this is usually very scary for a local judge to do, but also can be very fruitful. Modeling innovation, I'll give an example. Several community courts around the country are held in unique places, and one that's really popular is the libraries. So many community courts serve folks in the community who are unhoused. And so just after doing some real thinking and wondering, where can we as a court space be accessible, be comfortable for people to go see, and just dawned on someone one day, a lot of our participants, it's cold outside, a lot of our participants who are unhoused spend a lot of time in the local public library. And they decided, what, once a week we can have a judge show up. We can have a court clerk show up. We can get the VPN in there so our computer, our laptop is secure, and we can hold court where people already are. That really got rid of a lot of bench warrants that needed to happen, right? And it got people connected with service providers on the spot, right? Capturing people and their attention before they could leave the building. And that's been really successful innovation that's been modeled by some community courts. Advancing equity. When I think of this, I think of courts modeling transparency, modeling anti-racism, and modeling how to actively avoid bias and prejudice in the work that they do every single day. Prioritizing community-based solutions. Okay, so this is looking to those with lived experience. This echoes some other things we've talked about, and partnering with local service providers to really connect case participants with needed services that are right there in their local community to uplift for local service providers as well. And last but not least, promoting accountability. So we, as community justice practitioners, believe in using evidence-based interventions that have been proven to reduce recidivism, which I'll go over soon, talk about some stats, super fun. And accountability here, I'll also say, is tied to promoting victim safety as well. So a really important piece to think about here, of course, is trauma. I believe that this group, you all here, have a good handle on trauma. So I'll just highlight a few ideas that can relate to our courtroom practice. And so I like to think of being trauma responsive, of course, a step beyond just being trauma informed, right? But actually actively doing something based on the information that you have. And I'll ground some of this in research here. But let me first start with this great quote. It's sort of my rule not to read things on slides, but I'm going to break that rule because this is important and I might break it twice today. So watch out. This is an observation that someone made about court. You can see the citation there on the bottom. I'll just read it. It says, if someone set out to design a court, no, well, I spoiled it. If someone set out to design a system to provoke symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, it might look very much like a court of law. Yikes. The court system is a high-risk space for a survivor of trauma. To promote healing, a survivor needs social acknowledgement, control over their lives, and an opportunity to tell their story on their terms. Remember these. We'll talk about some really similar ideas soon. So this is absolutely true for victims who often suffer re-traumatization and unwanted, re-encounters with their abuser while they were in court, or some other perpetrator, right? The related angle I'm going to focus on today, however, is that this is also true for the alleged perpetrator. Here, the research I'm presenting is about people I've mentioned primarily accused of low-level misdemeanors like property crimes, or what we call quality of life crimes, which are often associated with homelessness. So think of things like loitering, public intoxication, public urination. I know this perhaps is a bit of a different angle that than this audience might be used to, but hear me out. I'm also very well aware that defendants in the criminal justice system already have significantly more rights built into the system than victims do. But I want to remind us that perpetrators, at least a lot of them, were often victims first. And if we as a system can properly and effectively intervene at this point, if not earlier, but at least at this point, then there do not need to be more and more and more people victimized by a person who instead we can focus on bringing to a place of healing. That's our goal. The additional rights and touch points already built in for defendants puts prosecutors and other system players in a really good position to affect a defendant whose life can change trajectories, right? So that we don't see them in court as a perpetrator again. So long and short of it is, I'm talking about healing as a way to prevent future victimizations. And globally, I'll say the center's goal in problem-solving courts is to prevent re-victimization by realigning court responses in a way that are actually effective. Okay, moving on. So here's where I'm going to ground some of these claims in research that are all going to be on your handout. So we know about, the devastating effects that victimization can have on mental health. This is absolutely undisputed. Many defendants, as I've said, are also survivors themselves. So the same holds true for them. Mental illness and PTSD are extremely prevalent among people accused of crime. I've got some things listed up on the screen. And I'd love to note also that justice involved females tend to be particularly likely to, and I'm quoting here from some research quote, to have complex backgrounds with high rates of victimization and complex psychiatric problems. there's a lot going on in their life. Move to the next slide. So like the previous slide, which had the title Mental Health and Defendants, trauma among defendants is also very pronounced. This is an issue, I would say, of intersectionality, frankly. This is a research-backed connection between trauma and criminality, right? As as well as additional connections when we consider the intersection, of identities, including gender and race or ethnicity under a trauma responsive umbrella. Okay, so now's a good time, I believe, to share at least one of the reasons why I advocate for giving someone with trauma a second look before attempting to lock them up and throw away the key, proverbially. And that's because although I am an attorney, I'm an advocate, I'm a parent, I'm also a trauma survivor, probably like many listening today, and I live with PTSD. So at my most symptomatic, I would have really, truly have struggled with attending a basic court hearing. To some extent, even now, I still exhibit the occasional exaggerated startle response, a real hallmark symptom of PTSD. And if you're not quite sure what that is, think of like a Shakespearean stage whisper that's like sort of supposed to be a whisper, but everyone can hear it. I think of it as like a stage gasp, like just gulping loud, cartoonish whenever something surprises you. That's how I would describe it. And I'm one for whom sudden loud noises can even now still trigger a trauma response, which could be misinterpreted, right? By a judge, by an attorney, court staff as being disrespectful, right? As talking out of turn, as being non-compliant, could get me in some trouble, just for what to me is automatic behavior I have very little or no control over. So if someone like me, when I was at my most symptomatic, was sitting in court as a defendant, and out of nowhere, the court crier yells very loud, "All rise," I would have been stressed and probably even angry. If I didn't understand things in the proceedings and they weren't going the way I had imagined beforehand, I know I also would have been stressed and angry. I would not be inclined to ask for help, but I would be inclined to close in on myself and probably to seek comfort and stability, perhaps in harmful ways, right? So although PTSD is a mental health issue, it manifests so very physically and so very relationally and can be set off in really unexpected ways that we as practitioners need to always have our eyes open for. So the importance of being aware, being empathetic of this in the courts cannot be overstated to me, and I think to many of us. As a defense attorney in criminal court, drug court, I mentioned human trafficking court, and so forth, I saw people tense up and react in, according to court culture, really culturally inappropriate ways. Didn't make sense in the moment or wasn't what you would expect someone to do in that situation. And as I saw people's trauma responses really bubble up, taking forms of anger, appearing overly demanding or appearing impatient. Really what they were experiencing was very real self-defense mechanisms that were kicking in as they truly were losing control over their situation or even their physical autonomy or bodies. And I'll just say, I can't think of something that's more of a nightmare situation for a person with PTSD to have someone standing behind you with your hands cuffed, unable to move, no bodily autonomy, not knowing what's going on, not knowing what the future holds. I mean, that's a nightmare for any of us, I think, but that's especially triggering for folks who experience PTSD. So given this knowledge, how might a prosecutor or another court player respond in a way that can be in acknowledgement and responsive of that? I'll go back to our favorite bubble chart. Here's again our guiding principles of community justice. So The prosecutor, they have lots of discretion at several intercept points throughout the life of a case. So let's think of ways that they can incorporate these principles. And I'm not just talking about prosecutors here, but judges, court clerks, we all have a part to play, right? And think about these principles as we're all making important decisions. Okay, so just as prosecutors may hopefully treat victims with trauma-informed practices, they can think about applying those same principles in their interactions with defendants, which maybe is something that never has come up before. So here's actually the same principles, but just in a list form in case you don't like the bubbles. So I'll give just a few examples of how I think a prosecutor or other court player could incorporate these principles in very real ways, very real examples. So as far as putting people first, we can remember, and this is hard to do. I know it's hard to do. When I walked into court with a stack like this, right? To remember that we work with people. We don't work with files. We don't even work with cases. We work with people. And what we do affects people's lives and the trajectory of their lives. When we're trying to co-create justice in the courtroom, remember, I'll say it again, think of that grassroots, right? Look to the victims and look to the larger community for solutions. Where a service provider or an opportunity to serve might really be just the ticket, right, for this person and really be super helpful and make the process meaningful, not just punitive for the sake of punishment. For modeling innovation, oh man, because of the prosecutor's great discretion, I just encourage them so strongly to just think outside of the box. You can do so much with the support of your office to create alternatives to incarceration that aren't just alternatives, but are effective alternatives. Advancing equity to me means that we ought to really be thinking and remembering that historically, access to alternatives, to ATIs, alternatives to incarceration, and to other offender intervention programs have been given unequally by race. And to think about how we can really try to correct that in our practice. Prioritizing community-based solutions means looking to the experts, partnering with local service providers. I'll say community courts do this really well because many of them, wherever they are in the library or wherever, they have partnerships, MOUs, really positive relationships with their local service providers that seem to come up again and again as being related to what folks need. And they invite them to just come be there, be way out in the hall. And when, so-and-so comes and I see that they are in need of some housing assistance, I say, guess what? Lucky day, housing coordinators in the hall. Go see them on your way out. And it just really allows courts to kind of capture the immediate attention and time of a person who, especially for those with less stable living situations, it's really hard to get in contact with them again as soon as they leave us in person. So to really be able to have that extremely warm handoff to say they're right here, go talk to them is really successful for community justice programs. And finally, promoting accountability. So we really want to make sure what we're using is evidence-based interventions, right, that are proven to reduce recidivism, that work, that make our community safer at the end of the day. And I promise I'd go over the research. I will go over the research that's happening soon, maybe even now. All right, so having a broader community justice lens and working with those local service providers I've been talking about sounds so nice, I hope. But does it work? I will spoil it again. I love a spoiler. Yes, is what I will say. Big all caps, yes, exclamation point. Recidivism decreases, costs to victims decreases, more ideas for prosecutors, judges, and others, I hope will come up on the following slides. So I really hate to be listy about to you again, but I think it's really important to understand how researchers define procedural justice before I tell you what researchers say about procedural justice. But just to kind of help put it in perspective, substantive justice is whether the law was followed and fairly applied, whereas procedural justice is whether the process itself is fair. Okay. And frankly, procedural justice, these 4 tenets you see on the screen, connect with all of those guiding principles of community justice. And I think the main point, frankly, is that when a court is operating with procedural justice, the participant can perceive that they are being treated with respect and that their concerns are being taken seriously, and that they truly were allowed their fair day in court. That's really like how I think people can most easily see this as a real thing. Did I have my fair shot? Right? If so, I probably was treated with procedural justice. So here's what researchers are looking for. They often will sit in courtroom, not nice and quiet in the back with their clipboards, and have their checklists, and they're seeing if participants had a real opportunity to be heard. Now, as former defense attorney, I can say I'm very guilty, like many of my colleagues, of giving my client sitting next to me a big, strong elbow to be quiet. That was not acting with procedural justice, right? But to actually give someone a real opportunity to tell their side of the story without fear of repercussions. That's having voice under the tenets of procedural justice. And I'll say it again, treating people as a person, not a file. Easier said than done. I know that too well. But to make sure that judges, attorneys, staff, everyone are treating participants, defendants, with dignity and with humanity, and that decision making is unbiased and trustworthy, free of prejudice. And finally, really the two-way street of understanding that both a participant can understand their own rights and understand what in the world's going on. We're not just talking legalese and Latin over their head. Happens, right? But that they know what's going on. And on the flip side, the court understands the nuances, the struggles, what's going on in that person's life. Okay, so here's some of the big findings of procedural justice that immediately, for this case that we're talking about, that a person has, that a person who believes, who feels, who knows that they were treated with procedural justice, they are more likely to comply with the court orders that come from that case. We're talking about stay away orders, right? Protective orders, paying victim damages, and staying out of trouble, right? That they're not having probation violations, that when they feel that their fair day was had in court, that's more important than whether they won or lost, whether they were guilty or not guilty, for them to comply with the law in the future. That's amazing. And that's not just a short-term effect, but it's a long-term effect too, that people continue to follow the law, not recidivize, and to not victimize in the future. That's awesome, right? We should all be like clapping and doing jumping jacks and high fives. That's awesome. That's amazing. The way we treat people can affect how they treat others. And when you kind of stop and think about it, you're like, oh, yeah, I'm a parent. That makes sense to me, right? So the big seminal research that came out of this is here from Tom Tyler. And so the quality of the interpersonal interactions in the courtroom are really what correlates with better outcomes after the courtroom, such as compliance with current court orders and future compliance with the law in really all regards. At the center, we speak of this in terms of the quality of relationships being more important than the quantity of intervention offered, right? So however long they got on probation or however long they got on a sentence, it's less important to future compliance with the law than having a good, high quality, trustworthy experience when you had your fair day in court, right? And this is rooted in decades of data. So what I like to say is it isn't soft, it's science, and it works. researchers have kept looking at this. And although I will say it is difficult, maybe impossible, to make a causal connection between procedural justice and compliance, researchers are still finding it again and again. And they found a third critical element in this strong association. And that element is, you see right there in the middle, it's the perception of a court's legitimacy, right? When elements of procedural justice are present in court, court users are more likely to perceive that the court and its mandates are more legitimate, that they're worth obeying, right? And when court legitimacy is present, court users are more likely to comply with court orders and less likely to offend in the future. So same findings, but with this little additional caveat that it's not just A equals B, but you've got that middle thing in there, that what's driving compliance, what's driving people to obey court orders is believing in the legitimacy of the justice system, which at this point in our national history is really important. Okay, here's the second time I'm going to break my rule of reading things on slides because I think this is really important. So there's this huge, big meta-analysis by Walters and Bolger. They looked at all these procedural justice research that's been done over the years. You can see 64 studies, 95 samples, 196 effect sizes. It's big. They looked at it all. And when taking it all into account, here's what they said. Legitimacy beliefs, that's that middle component there, right, are instrumental in promoting compliance with the law. That's powerful. Okay, this is from Walters alone, published a paper subsequent to that one. And this is more from the perspective of the defendant, court user, right, after they leave court. So let's say they have that belief in the legitimacy of the court system. Life can happen, right? And this is asking the question, how can we bolster that versus what can derail that legitimacy belief? So these are all the factors that he points to as being the most important to maintain a life free of victimization, of committing crimes. And these, if you're familiar with R&R, risk need responsivity research, have a really interesting relationship to that, to what is found like lacking in people said to be at high risk of committing a crime. And the idea is the same, right? Pro-social factors can make a person resilient to recidivism, i.e. less risky in R&R assessments. But let's not put the onus, entirely on the defendant. How can we support court participants in ways that develop this resiliency that we really would love to help develop, right? So we can best teach these things by, one, connecting participants directly, think those ultra warm handoffs, right, with competent service providers who practice in these ways. And by two, modeling this behavior ourselves, right? So we can use, looking at these factors, we can use a strengths-based approach when talking about defendants. We can be realistic about what we're asking them to do. We can celebrate their progress along the way. I've seen drug courts, for example, be really good at giving all the claps and all the praise, right? And people need and crave and want that. And it can work. And we can give defendants opportunities for self-determination, right? For autonomy, making meaningful choices themselves, and for developing professional and personal relationships, by recommending mentors, by getting someone into AA or NA and to get a sponsor, and by thinking about restoring harms done to relationships. We can model these. And again, it's not soft, it's science. These are the resilience factors that keep someone from breaking the law in the future. Okay, so then to sum up a little bit to this point, and I'm keeping an eye on our time, according to the research, you and me, we can help foster compliance and discourage recidivism by demonstrating procedural justice in the courtroom. It's amazing that that small amount of interaction can really have lifelong effects. And we can do that also by working transparently, by working equitably, so that court users can see that they are being treated fairly, that your authority as a court, as a part of the state, is legitimate and trustworthy. And then next, we can encourage prolonged resilience through these pro-social supports that help prevent recidivism by really fostering individual connections to help build a person's own capacity for hope, all those things, for self-determination, autonomy, human capital, positive relationships, and to view themselves from a strength-based light. Okay, I knew I'd get to this point and say I have to skip some slides. I'm gonna have to skip some slides. Okay, I want to though review some of the evaluations, independent process and outcome evaluations that have been done of community courts that work really, really hard to incorporate procedural justice into their practice. And I will say you're not missing too much because they all say about the same thing, which is that it is very successful. So I'll start with this slide. This is from research that came out of the Red Hook Community Justice Center in Brooklyn, what I called, maybe one of the most well-known community courts in the country. They host visitors from all around the country and even globally, right around the world, to share a glimpse of how they practice community justice and procedural justice. And you can see here that in their time of operation at this point had been, I think, 10 or 15 years that they'd been in operation. And look at that number. We're talking in the millions of dollars of avoided costs to victims. We're talking about financial costs here, which of course is a pretty small part of the story, right? It's not just money that's being saved when someone is able, free to live a life without committing crimes. Stress of being victimized, right? Anxiety, injury, time from work, PTSD, perhaps, relationship strain, all these things can be avoided, right? And all these things are being avoided by looking at defendants and focusing on a little more holistic healing approach and letting them see the value of the justice system. Okay, here's from Spokane, Washington. I'll just leave this here. I won't talk it through too much, but that when compared with their peers, community courts in the purple and regular criminal courts in the white, compared with their peers after both 6 months and 12 months, the community court participants had fewer new crimes. This is San Francisco. The community court catchment area was just in that little blue funny shape. And they compared people with similar backgrounds, similar crimes, similar attributes in as many ways as they could measure as researchers, who was on one side of the blue line and the other. And they also had some really positive findings from the report itself, which is cited there. It said that not only were people who are in community court less and less likely to commit crimes in the future, but their peers just on the other side of the street were more and more likely to commit crimes in the future. So we have this big diverging difference happening based on how someone was treated in court. This is plopped straight out of the process and evaluation published in December 2020 for the Eugene, Oregon Municipal Community Court. And you can see the yellow bars are community court participants. The blue bars are the comparison group. So similar in every way, except that they had their case heard in criminal court. And for all three of those groupings, that's new arrest, new conviction, new incarceration, that those who participated in community court were significantly less likely to experience those events. This is also from Eugene Community Court. I'll just highlight, this is kind of their ROI, right? Return on investment, what all financial stakeholders want to see all the time, that even accounting for the costs of operation to have the separate community court docket, that they still, even with actually very few number of participants, were saving lots of money. And as I've said before, money isn't everything, but it definitely is something, at least for some stakeholders. And this is not even taking into account cost savings to victims. Okay, so here's some of our takeaways. Treating people as people, being aware of and responsive to their potential histories of trauma, modeling positive relationships, positive self-talk, right? Strengths-based approach even to our own selves, and being transparent enough so that all court users can see that the process itself is fair and that their circumstances, their unique individual person and lives were taken into account, really all combined together to help move the needle forward towards healing, and ultimately will lead to healthier individuals, safer communities, and less victims in the future. That's what we go for, and that's what we are seeing in the research as it's playing out so far. So this is my email address. Please take it down. I'll take questions at any time, but I'm also happy to take questions now. Here's some of the research citations, but like I said, that will be in a handout. So I will stop sharing and I will let Katie come on back.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. This was really, really informative, and I'm already thinking of ways that we can use it in our own work. So I really appreciate it. I want to remind everyone, questions, please put them in the Q&A, and I will go through and read some of those out. If we do not get to your question, we're going to send those to Lindsay afterwards so she can follow up with folks. And then, of course, I think a lot of the answers will probably be in all of the supplemental materials that she's sending out. But if you have questions right now, give everybody a couple minutes to get those in. Remember, please put them in the Q&A section. It is next to the chat. Lindsay, your first question is just wonderful to start with. Great presentation. Question, does Lindsay know she is awesome and appreciated?
I do now. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
I see one in the chat, so we'll just go ahead and read it there. What are the crime types that these studies have followed? I know the Eugene study did not involve victims of crime.
Yeah, so I think I understand your question to be when you're looking at recidivism after participation in a community justice initiative, they look at all new arrests. So they look at, as far as recidivism, everything under the sun, just to see if there was a new arrest. But if you're asking about what types of crimes were heard, that the community court had jurisdiction over, is primarily low-level offenses. Often community courts are part of municipal courts, so they can hear both city ordinance violations or general misdemeanors. These are often not crimes of violence. I will say, though, there is a growing tide among community courts to start hearing felony cases, specifically if they're not crimes of violence. But generally, we're talking about low-level offenses for the cases that are being brought into the community court to begin with. But when we're looking at recidivism, we're looking at all types of crime.
All right. How do you provide communities with the statistical data that community courts are an effective way to prevent re-victimization?
Oh, well, although I didn't spend too much time on it, often people really want to hear that boring ROI slide. Like they want to show me the money, But I think it comes down to knowing your audience, that it's both sharing from a personal side, right, about what it means for someone, as like we have parents come in and say, does my kid need to get arrested to get help? And of course the answer should be no. And to think about every person that comes in, has people who love them, right? That someone who gets help can changed, can become housed, can stop being an abuser if possible, can, stop stealing from this family who owns a store. That really thinking about that restorative justice lens of it. At the Red Hook Community Justice Center, they do a lot of restorative peace circles, peacemaking programming is really robust there. And so that's a big part of it, telling that personal story about how we're talking about individuals and relationships, and that's priceless, right? And for families who are talking about, my child, my partner was really changed by actually finally getting connected with services that our insurance wouldn't have covered, or that we just couldn't get on the wait list for to save our lives, literally. But thinking about the human costs of when we're actually getting people connected with needed services, and then the end result being we're not needing to worry about others in the future who may have been in a destructive path, in their destructive path, right? Before. So telling that human story, and then also getting down to that nitty gritty and thinking about, and I can maybe share some of those too, some of the recent community court, they're all done by independent organizations, process and outcome evals that say, yeah, it's effective as far as recidivism. It's also effective as far as financial costs. And sometimes one is more persuasive than the other to the folks you're talking to.
So your next one is, thank you for an excellent presentation. I'd appreciate recommendations for how to establish the partnerships you've described with service providers. For example, is grant funding typically necessary?
Ooh, not necessarily. Often, this is the most painful answer that lawyers love to give, which is that it depends, right? But what courts do really differs. Some service providers, for example, are grant funded or federal funded, whatever, to serve a certain number of clients. Really doesn't matter how you get them, right? That's gold for you as a court practitioner to say, okay, well, how about we give you a desk one afternoon a week, and will directly refer people to you, and that's like a no cost problem, right? That they're getting numbers and you are able to have someone to refer to. That's wonderful. But also, yes, as far as like federal granting and others, you could always have a sub-awardee as a vetted local practitioner, so that can be immediately built into your programming. So there's a lot of ways you can do it, and sometimes even community-based organizations will see the value, and maybe see the value also of kind of elevating themselves in the eyes of the courts, and voluntarily come and provide services. So it can happen in many ways, and really just is a matter of bringing people together at the table. Before COVID, and some of this has gone to Zoom or has stopped, it had been really valuable for local practitioners in a certain area. Like when I was working in child welfare, once a month, there was all these practitioners who worked with foster children, would come together and just talk about current issues. And also, like, one would be spotlit like every month, and they get to kind of brag and showcase about their programming, and with really high turnover in some of these service sectors, it was a really good chance to be able to keep abreast of what's going on and meet new faces. So being willing to be a convener is also really important. And sometimes that's all it takes, is building those relationships by just saying, hey, we have space right here in this room, the courthouse. Let's get together. Let's do it on Zoom. Maybe that's easier. And let's talk about current issues. Let's get to know each other so that we can share the pie and not live on this sort of scarcity mindset among service providers.
Does the information you shared regarding positive behavior change being affected by how an individual is treated during their experience when going through court processes include minor statistics as well? I'm guessing that this person is referring to juveniles.
Yeah.
Please let us know if that's not what you're talking about.
Yeah. That's what my assumption is too. The research I all shared today was all focused on adults. I'm trying to think, I'm like doing a Rolodex like flip in my mind. I think they were all based on adult criminal populations. But I would expect similar things from juveniles, but of course, it's not quite the same, right? But yeah, thank you, Marnita.
Has there ever been a survey from victims on how they feel about community courts taking the place of the normal court route?
I'm not 100% sure, but they're often one, kind of anecdotal. We always talk to people. And as far as things like the restorative justice recommendations from a community court, that's only ever done with the consent of the victim. As far as being in the community court itself, it is common practice for prosecutors to reach out to victims and let them know, if someone is eligible, then they're often just eligible, right? But it's just courtesy practice to say this is what's going on. And often, especially because we're talking about low level offenses, often property offenses, often business owners, they're really happy about it. And in fact, I've talked to business owners who are like, hey, I'll give them an internship. I want them to know how hard it is to run a business and maybe appreciate a little bit better what it means when my window gets broken for the umpteenth time, and how that affects me. So I've actually found, as far as victims within the business bureau, whatever that is called in your local area, have been super supportive of that. But often the eligibility criteria are written that victim consent's not required, but it's always a conversation with the prosecutor, and 99% of the time it's very positive.
I'll also add that the Alliance for Safety and Justice, if y'all are familiar with their work, they've done a number of nationwide studies on survivors' opinions of justice reform, community courts, restorative justice. I would encourage you to check those out too, because they found overwhelmingly that folks were in favor of those different measures as opposed to just incarceration. Let's see, is there a recommended length of jurisdiction for a community court to be effective? Relatedly, are there strengths and challenges identified that are unique to the pretrial community court programs?
You might have to read that again. Is there a recommended?
Okay, do you want I'll do the
Yeah.
first one and then we can do the second one.
Okay.
Is there a recommended length of jurisdiction for community court to be effective?
I'm not exactly sure what that means. The length of jurisdiction. You might have to put in the chat again.
And that was an anonymous, so please feel free to send us a direct message if you want us to re-answer that. Let's see. The second part is, are there strengths and challenges identified that are unique to pretrial community court programs?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think one of the strengths is the opportunity for someone to have a case resolved without it being on their record. If we're doing something in a pretrial space, often at the end of the day, the judge will dismiss anything that happens. We're not giving community court as a post-trial alternative or as a sentence, right? So that actually gives us a really big kind of carrot, right? Especially when we're talking about low-level offenses, we have very low amount of legal leverage, right? And so it's usually voluntary, and sometimes defense attorneys are saying, "Ugh, don't mess with that, and you'll be in there for 3 months or whatever. Just like you have time served, we'll get this out of the way," right? And that, there's some validity to that. But when we're talking about healing and helping the community overall be healthier because its community members are healthier, that's not ideal. So I think I got off track on answering that question, but let's see.
And can you provide tools on how to start a community court initiative and who should start it? States attorneys or courts, community organizations?
Ooh, I love this question. So yes, please email me and I can send you some information, sort of like an implementation guide or checklist of things to be thinking about while you're starting it up. And it has to really be done in partnership. I've seen it be instigated by anyone under the sun, right? But to have those, I would say the big three court people present, the defense, prosecution, and the court, if they're all on the same page, they can set policy that boom happens, and then getting your local community service providers or other service providers on board is what I would say also really critical. But a next step that really, if you want things to move quickly, then you're going to want to have those legal stakeholders be really committed. But it is a community court, right? And it should come because community members are saying, we want to see something different, right? So not just going to your stakeholders, yes, going to your stakeholders, but not just going to your stakeholders, making sure you're doing a community service, you're holding some kind of focus group, or you're, as a prosecutor's office, for example, always hearing the same thing, from people, and having some sort of connection, some sort of ear to the ground of what is going on in the neighborhood, in the city, wherever your jurisdiction lies, to think about. That's the partnership. That's the marriage I see. Is that grassroots connected with the legal system actors who can really set policy.
All right, we're going to do one more. We just have just enough time. So, gosh, I love what you're saying, 30 years in the business, and I hope to see it. Is there a concern that victims see this as being lighter on the offender? How might this affect victims, say, of domestic violence?
Yeah, no, and I will, to be frank, most, not all, but most community justice initiatives are a little afraid of domestic violence for exactly that reason, and don't always want to hear those cases because, yeah, I think that's a very real fear. But I also think that once people are given a chance, and often this is like a prosecutor and victim conversation, to say, this is exactly how it's going to go down. Maybe here's even like a case flow chart, right? This person is going to be given a risk, need, responsivity assessment to see what's going on in their life. This person is going to be referred to services, and this person's going to be held accountable to report to them, to be compliant with them. And once the judge is comfortable with where they're at, then this case is going to be over. And we're thinking that, rather than saying, oh, well, you already got time served, all done, that it's actually making a person do a lot more and actually keeping eyeballs on a person for a lot longer than they might going through a traditional criminal route for these low-level offenses.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Mm-hmm.
This was amazing. We really appreciate all of your hard work in putting this together and presenting for us. I know you have a whole host of things that you're going to be sending to our team to send out to all the attendees. So we really appreciate that. And thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Everyone, thanks for joining the last session of our Road to NTI webinar series. We hope to see you all in Boston in less than a month. Let us know if you have any questions about the conference or the presentation. We're happy to pass those along to Lindsay. She also just added her email again in the chat, so feel free to grab that and we'll include it in the follow-up emails as well. Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you, Lindsay. Have a great day.
Bye. Thanks, folks.